Hello and welcome back to Skeptics in the Pub Online and our first talk of the new year. I'm Dave from Coventry Skeptics in the Pub, and I'm just the face of Skeptics in the Pub Online for this week. Each week's event is brought to you by a collaboration of skeptics in the pub groups from around the country, all working together to bring interesting speakers with a skeptical note. We've already announced our first 4 speakers for this year, and hopefully, like me, you're really excited about some of the topics we have coming up. And if you haven't seen the announcements yet, then check out either our social media or our website at sitp.online. We're hoping to get some more announced very soon. Over the break, we've been running a colouring competition using pictures of science, technology, engineering and maths heroes put together by one of our speakers from last year, Kit Chapman. This competition will be closing next week, but it's a great opportunity for those of you teaching your kids at home as some inspiration to engage them on some amazing people from all backgrounds working in science right now, as well as what science and critical thinking is all about. There's also the opportunity to win a prize. We'd normally be asking for donations to us to support what we do, but with what's going on around the country right now, we'd like to ask donations towards Magic Breakfast. They're a registered charity aiming to end hunger as a barrier to education in the UK. Schools through the provision of healthy breakfast to children living with food poverty. And you can do this through our usual link of sitp.online/donate. And all donations tonight will go straight to the charity. The format will be the usual, a talk followed by a short break for refreshments and a comfort break. We'll then have a Q&A with our speaker, followed by our regular Zoom virtual pub, the Lock-ins Razor, where we can all get together and have a chat. If you want to ask a question, then you need to go to sitp.online/ask, where you'll be able to ask or upvote questions to be asked. You do not need an account, but if you put your name in at least, then we can read out who asked the question. Tonight's speaker, we have Rosie Campbell. Rosie leads the Safety Critical AI program at the Partnership on AI, a multi-stakeholder non-profit shaping the future of responsible AI. Her main focus is on responsible publication and deployment practices for increasingly advanced AI. Previously, she was Assistant Director of the Centre for Human Compatible AI at UC Berkeley, a research engineer at BBC R&D, and co-founder of Manchester Futurists. Her academic background spans physics, philosophy, and computer science. Rosie is also a productivity nerd and enjoys thinking about how to optimize systems and how to use reason and evidence to improve the world. So I'd like you all to put your virtual hands together and welcome Rosie Campbell.
Thank you so much, Dave. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I hope you can hear me all right. I moved to the US about 3 years ago, and one of the things I miss most about the UK is the skeptical community. So it's really nice to be back and interacting with you all today. So I'm going to be talking about the high stakes nature of AI research, and in particular, the question of when research might be too dangerous to publish and how we can navigate that. You can find me at my website, rosiecampbell.me, or on Twitter at Rosie Campbell. I don't tweet too much these days because Twitter sort of stresses me out, but I do read my messages and mentions if you want to ask me any questions. So today we're going to cover, firstly, some of the impacts of AI research. I want to talk to you about how we've seen research in AI have real effects on the world. I'll then talk a little bit about the controversies that we've seen recently in the AI community that relate to this topic. And I'll then discuss some of the difficult questions that we are facing that have arisen out of these controversies. Then I'll go on to talk about what I've learned from working on this topic of publication norms in AI over the last year and a half or so. Then I'll discuss what we can learn from other fields like biosecurity, nuclear security, cybersecurity, that kind of thing. I'll then move on to talking about 5 possible interventions that we are exploring as potential solutions to this challenge, and I'll also talk about their limitations. And then finally, I'll just leave you with a few parting thoughts. So before we dive in, I just want to get some terms clarified because people use these in very different ways. The definitions, or the way I like to use these terms, are that artificial intelligence, or AI, is the thing we're trying to achieve. So it's the goal we're trying to get to. Whereas machine learning, or ML, is a popular technique to get there. So machine learning can be used for things that aren't artificial intelligence, and there are also other ways other than machine learning that people have been exploring to get to artificial intelligence. But in general, these two things are used pretty interchangeably just because generally most machine learning is used for AI, and also it is the main way that people are exploring AI. So I will use those terms interchangeably, so hopefully that clarifies any confusion. So I want to start by talking about the impacts of AI research, and I'm going to start by telling you about a little sort of speculative illustrative tale. This is something that my former boss, Stuart Russell, who is a pioneer of AI research, often talks about, and he spent his whole career developing AI technology, but he's now moved to focus much more on the impacts of AI and how to ensure AI is going to be safe and beneficial for humanity. And I think this is a great example of the challenge we're facing. So in the 1980s, some probability theorists started getting interested in the problem of multi-armed bandits. This is the idea that imagine you have an array of slot machines in front of you, and you've got to figure out which one is going to give you the highest reward and pay out the most. Probably the best thing to do is to begin by just randomly pulling all the levers on all the different ones and spend a while just seeing which ones are paying out the most. Once you've got an idea about which one is going to pay out the most and the most frequently, you'd probably just focus in on that one and pull that lever over and over again to maximize your reward. And so this encompasses what is known in the machine learning world as the explore-exploit trade-off. You want to spend some of your time trying to explore different options, but once you've figured out what is the best one, you want to double down and exploit that to get the highest reward. So really, it's a problem about optimizing under certain constrained resources. Some bright spark then had the idea to apply this to online ads and for making money. So when you visit a website, you're not necessarily, the people serving the ads aren't necessarily sure what's going to be interesting to you. They're not sure what you're going to want to click on. They have limited real estate in terms of the screen size, and they have limited, your attention is a limited resource from their perspective as well. So in a sense, this is a multi-armed bandit problem where they're optimizing to try and show you the ads that you're most likely to click on. And what they found was that engagement was a big predictor of how often people were likely to click on ads. And so we started seeing a lot of websites optimize for engagement, encouraging people to like, share, subscribe, all of those kinds of things. Unfortunately, one of the best ways to generate engagement is using outrage. I'm sure we've all been in this situation where someone is wrong on the internet and we just can't leave it alone, and we stay and we're stuck to our screen trying to resolve it. So the more time we are spent sitting at our screen, the more likely we are to click on ads. So that is one way that has been pretty successful. Unfortunately, that outrage has arguably led to increased polarization over the last few years, and we're seeing more and more that the different ends of the political spectrum are viewing each other as enemies. And then that's how you end up in a situation where you have a QAnon shaman dressed as a Viking rioting in the Capitol building in the US. So, given that chain of events, I just want to encourage you to consider a few questions. Could we have anticipated that? When we were thinking about the multi-armed bandit problem in the 1980s, that was a very theoretical thing. Could we have anticipated this chain of events to lead us where we are right now in the world? If so, should we have done anything differently? And if so, at what point should we have intervened? And who would be responsible for noticing that and doing something about it? These are kind of the questions that I think are super important as we develop increasingly advanced AI at the moment. Now, obviously, that was a kind of hypothetical or a speculative chain of events, and that everything is much more complicated than that. And I'm sure there are many different reasons why we are seeing things like the polarization and the way the world is at the moment. So I just also want to give you a few more examples. In case you're not fully bought into that chain of events, here's some other ways that we are seeing AI causing pretty significant impacts on the world. So firstly, we have biased algorithms. Now, when you are training a machine learning model, you have to use a lot of data. And if that data is poorly selected, so there's bias in the collection of that data, or if the world that you're drawing the data from is biased, even if you're sampling correctly, but the world itself is biased in some way, then you can end up with biased algorithms. And we've seen that already with algorithms that are used in the domain of criminal justice, where they're being used to predict things like how high risk individuals have been arrested are. And what we're seeing is that white people are getting rated as much lower risk than black people with equivalent backgrounds or other factors. So the algorithm, which has been trained on historical data, which we know has, incorporates lots of systemic oppression, means that we have these biased outcomes, which most people think are unacceptable. You may have also seen deep fakes. This is where you can basically make it look as if someone is saying something or behaving in a certain way by transplanting their face onto someone else's body, or even generating a person from scratch. And there are a lot of concerns around deep fakes, but one in particular, I think, is around misinformation. So the way that you can make it look like someone is saying a certain thing, could sow doubt in a lot of domains and could be particularly politically dangerous. I even saw recently, after the riots that took place in the US the other week, Donald Trump posted a kind of not quite an apology video, but a conciliatory sort of encouraging people to keep the peace video. And I saw a lot of people claiming that they thought that might be a deep fake. So we have a problem not only where videos can be faked, but also the fact that now even real videos, there's this sort of air of doubt around them, which makes it very hard to validate real videos. And that can sow a lot of confusion and doubt among the public. Another issue we are seeing more and more is that of surveillance. So as machine learning is used for like facial recognition type applications, more and more places around the world are using that technology to surveil people. And in some ways that can have very useful applications, but it also can be a big danger to civil liberties, and it's the kind of thing that could easily get very quickly rolled out. We haven't necessarily thought through the consequences of it. Another potential impact of AI that we are starting to see is increased automation. Obviously, this is pretty obvious in the case of replacing factory workers with robots, but more and more, I think we're going to see even white-collar jobs getting replaced by automation. So we could be facing a world over the next decade or so where we see mass technological unemployment, and obviously that's going to have wide-sweeping effects. We're increasingly seeing autonomous vehicles becoming better and better. And if they do take off and become a part of our daily lives, then I think we're going to see huge disruption to how people live their lives, how our cities are designed, hopefully mostly for the better, but could potentially create some interesting challenges. And then looking a bit further towards the future, we have efforts to create artificial general intelligence or superintelligence. This is the idea that we might get to a point where it's possible to essentially have a machine that equals or surpasses human level intelligence. So not only would that have massive implications for work and automation, if you can get computers to do most things that humans already do, but also what that means for power imbalances between humans and machines. Some people dismiss this concern as sci-fi, but there are a lot of legitimate AI researchers who are very worried about this problem and are working on safeguards for that at the moment. So what this is meant to illustrate, essentially, is that AI research can be both high stakes in the sense that it could go very, very well, or it could go very, very wrong, but also dual use. And this is a term that's used often to talk about research or technology that can be both very, very beneficial, but can also be misappropriated and used for harmful purposes. And unfortunately, the default mode of most tech companies is something similar to move fast and break things, which, while makes progress happen quickly, may not be the right approach when we're dealing with high stakes and dual use technology. And that brings me to my focus, which is essentially looking at the question of how can we conduct AI research responsibly to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks? And then more specifically, what research practices and publication norms do we need to do that? I work at the Partnership on AI, which is a multi-stakeholder nonprofit to benefit people and society. We have a whole range of partner organizations that we work with, primarily nonprofits, but also a lot of industry organizations and academic institutions. And it's during my time at PAI that I have been focused on this question of doing AI research responsibly. And I think we're in a pretty good position to do that work because a lot of it involves coordination between lots of different entities across the research ecosystem. Okay, so now I want to bring you some of the recent controversies that have happened in the AI community, which have sparked a lot of interesting questions. In 2019, a company called OpenAI built an advanced language model called GPT-2. Now, what this does is it takes a sentence and then that you give it, and then it generates an entire essay in the style of that sentence. So if you give it a sentence that is in the style of a 5-year-old writing a story, it will generate a whole essay in that style. And similarly, if you give it a sentence that sounds like the first line of a president's speech, it will generate a whole pretty convincing president's speech. Now, it's not 100% perfect. If you look very closely, you can tell that it's not written by a human, but it's pretty good. Like at first glance, you would be, most people I think would be taken in. And it doesn't take much of an imagination to imagine the ways that this could go wrong. For example, imagine if spammers or email scammers doing phishing, that kind of thing, got hold of this and they could suddenly generate tons and tons of very convincing emails that were potentially very targeted at individuals and take advantage of them. There's also the chance that it could be used for fake news. So if you're trying to sow the seed of misinformation about a particular topic, you can now generate tons and tons of realistic looking news articles that all cover some topic that you're trying to spread and make it look like lots of people are reporting on this issue. And then there are obviously more mundane concerns, like it could easily allow students to cheat at their coursework or exams, that kind of thing. So what OpenAI did to try and mitigate some of these concerns is that they took a staged release approach. And what that looked like is start by releasing a smaller version of the model, so a model that was less capable and less convincing. They released that to the public and sort of just observed how people were using it, looked at whether any of their concerns were actually coming to fruition or whether people were mostly just like having a good time and playing around with it. Once they were satisfied that things weren't going too badly and that they'd put some mitigation measures in place, they released a slightly larger version. And they did the same thing, stand back, wait to see what happens, did some sort of research, partnering with universities to check how it was being used. And then the same thing, they then released an even larger version and so on. So this approach caused a huge backlash in the AI community. Well, actually, it caused a huge disagreement within the AI community. Some people were actually really impressed with it. So here's a tweet from someone that says, "Going so far as to think ahead to malicious uses and check in with stakeholders sets a new bar for ethics in AI. Well played, OpenAI." So some people thought this was a step on the way to more ethical AI. Other people had a different opinion. Here's someone who says, "What you're doing is the opposite of open. It is unfortunate that you hype up and propagate fear and thwart reproducibility and scientific endeavor." And another person that says, "We all want safe, responsible AI research. The first step is not misrepresenting the significance of your results to the public, not obfuscating your methods, and not spoon-feeding fear-mongering press releases to the media." These are pretty influential AI researchers, and so there's obviously a huge spectrum of different opinions on this. And OpenAI had to do a lot of work to listen to the different perspectives and then change their approach. But basically, it's not really resolved yet how we can deal with this kind of release strategy. The next incident I want to talk about is the Neural Information Processing Systems Conference, which is more commonly known as NeurIPS. This is a very prestigious, very popular machine learning conference. I think it's the most popular one in the world. Sell out in like a few minutes. So very influential. And in 2020, they actually introduced a new requirement, a broader impact statement. So they said authors are asked to include a section in their submissions discussing the broader impact of their work, including possible societal consequences, both positive and negative. So it's pretty common for researchers to talk about the best of their work. Usually, when they're talking about the motivation behind the research, researchers will list all the beneficial applications of their work. But it's much rarer, at least in the AI world, for people to include potential negative impacts of their work or the risks that we might want to expect. So this was a really interesting decision from Neurips to introduce this as a requirement. And as you can probably imagine, there were, again, a huge range of responses to this. So some positive, like this one, bravo, thrilled to see Neurips 2020 will have a required broader impact section discussing possible positive and negative societal consequences of their work. Whereas other people were less happy with this change. To be clear, I don't think this is a positive step. Societal impacts of AI is a tough field, and there are researchers and organizations that study it professionally. Most authors do not have expertise in the area and won't do good enough scholarship to say something meaningful. And this is a pretty common reaction, I think, among researchers, and one that is very fair. Researchers are an expert in their own narrow field. They're not necessarily able to anticipate the second and third order consequences of their research, especially if that involves economics, politics, society, things that are outside of their domain. So this is a very fair criticism, and I think illustrates a reaction that a lot of people have. Closer to the timing of the conference, another prominent researcher tweeted something along these lines. It's alarming that Neurips papers are being rejected based on ethics reviews. How do we guard against ideological biases in such reviews? Since when are scientific conferences in the business of policing the perceived ethics of technical papers? So again, going back to this issue of how we can expect scientists and technologists to anticipate things that are more in the realm of ethics. And this tweet caused a huge controversy on Twitter. There was massive arguments, people coming at it from all different perspectives. I think a few people had to end up using their Twitter accounts of it. It was a big deal. So hopefully this illustrates that there are some pretty difficult questions that are getting brought up that the AI community is wrestling with at the moment. And I think I now want to take you through some of those questions and some of the thinking that I've been doing and others in the community have been doing on these issues. So the first question is, how do we balance openness and caution? On one hand, scientific norms of open inquiry are probably to thank for many of the advantages that we all enjoy now in our lives since the industrial and scientific revolutions, basically. And also, openness is really important for other things like reproducibility. Now, you're all a bunch of skeptics. I do not need to tell you the value of reproducibility and reproducing experiments to see if they actually work. This is super important and something that if we erode norms of openness could be damaged. So we need to be really clear. And then finally, on this side, we have the idea that research often has a lot of beneficial applications. And if we end up restricting the availability of that research in any way, we're potentially missing out. There's an opportunity cost to missing out on beneficial applications of that technology. But then on the other side of things, most people would probably agree that if someone found out how to make a nuclear bomb from basic kitchen supplies, that they should probably not post that information online. So even if you're very, very pro-openness, usually most people have a line that they would draw where they would think actually the costs outweigh the benefits. So the question is, where do we draw that line? And this was actually something that happened for real in the biosecurity community a few years ago, where a group of researchers synthesized the horsepox virus, and they were going to publish a paper that actually listed out the exact instructions for how to reproduce that. And there was a huge concern among the community because if someone can replicate someone can synthesize the horsepox virus, that could potentially lead to smallpox coming back. And, with all the work that we have done as a species to eliminate smallpox, you could just undo that very quickly by publishing this information. So there was a huge discussion about how to handle that, whether it should be redacted in the bio community. And I think, both in the bio community and in the AI community, there are unresolved questions around how to handle this appropriately. The second question I want to pose is, whose responsibility is it to anticipate and mitigate these risks? Should it be on the individual researcher to think about this stuff? Should this be something that teams or research labs do as a group. Maybe they should have some sort of internal review process. Should this be part of the peer review process? Should it be the realm of peer reviewers or conference editors or journal editors to actually look at the papers that they're reviewing and see if there are any risks? Or should it be some sort of oversight mechanism, maybe through the government or something that actually imposes certain policies around how to handle these issues? Or is this an issue? Is this the responsibility of society at large? And if so, how do we divvy up? How do we actually go about and implement that? And I think an interesting thing to think about here is the individual versus the collective responsibility. So some other fields have things like professional ethics or professional codes of conduct that individuals have to sign up to in order to be allowed to practice in that field. So that's very much putting the emphasis on the individual upholding certain standards. Alternatively, there's the idea of a collective responsibility where rather than putting the burden on the individual researcher, we put infrastructure in place like review processes, checks, balances, that kind of thing, to make sure that this is more of a collective issue. And of course, as with most things, the answer is probably never one or the other. It's going to be some sort of mix of all of these. This is a tweet that I thought was interesting because it's someone who took on that personal responsibility themselves. They said, "I stopped doing computer vision research because I saw the impact my work was having. I loved the work, but the military applications and privacy concerns eventually became impossible to ignore." So do we want a world where individuals are making these ethical judgment calls themselves, or do we want some sort of wider community set of norms to help people navigate issues like this? And then the final question, which really follows from the previous two questions, is how do we effectively equip ourselves to navigate responsible publication? What resources do we need? What infrastructure needs to exist? Do we need frameworks, taxonomies, services, guidelines, institutions, and anything else? And I'm going to talk to you a bit about some of the ideas for this. But basically, yeah, if we want to encourage whether it's individual researchers or us as a community to address these issues now before they become a real problem, what do we need to do that effectively? Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about what I've learned with respect to these questions and the other issues I've mentioned, having spent around a year and a half thinking about this project. So firstly, it probably won't come as a surprise that there is a very wide spectrum of views between the openness and the caution side. So some people are very pro-openness no matter what, and other people are very much on the side of no, we need to be super, super careful. This is powerful technology. We should err on the side of caution and only publish things when we are sure that they are safe. And as you might expect, there is most people lie somewhere in between on that spectrum. And I'm kind of encouraged because through this work, I've talked to lots of different people with different perspectives, and even people who come in with very extreme views on this, once you speak to them, usually people do start to understand some of the nuances, and that makes me optimistic that we are able to have productive dialogue on this. Another thing I've noticed is that people's reaction to this issue tends to, and they sort of fall into three kind of categories based on what I think they are primarily valuing. So you have people who I am labeling like science first. These are people who see themselves primarily as scientists and do not see it as their responsibility to anticipate the risks of their work. They're there to push the boundaries of knowledge and make reproducible science, all of that kind of thing. Then there's another group of people who I'm calling the social justice first people, who are very concerned about the impact that AI is having right now on marginalized communities and the challenges that we're facing, very much today with these technologies. And I think these two groups have something in common around holding power accountable. So they both care about democratization of technology and justice, and just generally empowering individuals to hold power accountable, basically. And then the third cluster of values I've called long-term future first. This is people who are primarily concerned about the ultimate effects of AI as it becomes increasingly advanced. So as we get closer to artificial general intelligence, as we have widespread unemployment, those sort of slightly longer term concerns that could have effects on the trajectory of humanity. So they have something in common with the social justice crowd in that they both care about beneficial AI, and they both want AI to be responsible and safe, that kind of thing. And they also have something in common with the science-first people, which is that they are both interested in building robust mechanisms and institutions to take us forward into the future. Another thing I've learned is that there is no consensus yet. I think we are getting closer, at least to some kind of consensus on some issues, but it is still very controversial. And we have to be careful about moving too fast. When I started work on this project, one thing we wanted to do was basically come up with a set of recommendations or best practices for how to navigate these issues. But we realized very quickly that it was too early for that, and that we would need to do a lot more work to untangle the difficult questions that I posed today, to really talk to the community and understand their views. And so we shifted our focus to more community engagement rather than top-down recommendations. I generally think of this work as having two target audiences. The first are practitioners. So these are the people who are actually building the technology, the researchers and the engineers. And they tend to hold a lot of market power. And that's because AI is still, there's still not enough qualified AI researchers out there, which means that companies are all trying to wrestle with each other to attract the best talent. And that means that these practitioners can affect widespread cultural changes because they can actually, make certain demands. And because they're in such demand from the different companies, usually that is quite effective. They can cause grassroots change because they are in demand. And then we have what I sort of call gatekeepers, which is not a great word, but hopefully you get the point, which is kind of the people who have more direct power about what gets published. So grant makers, conference chairs, journal editors, that kind of thing. They hold more direct power and they can mandate widespread policy changes. So an example of that is the NeurIPS broader impact statement I mentioned earlier, which has a very quick effect across the community because suddenly now everyone has to abide by it. The danger of that, though, is if the first group of practitioners don't agree with that policy change, there can be a huge backlash, and that can be quite powerful. So my approach has been to work with both of these groups. On one hand, I think it's important to make progress by looking at which policy changes we might want to implement, but you also need to bring along the first group of practitioners so that they are on board with the changes that get made, so they kind of go hand in hand. Another thing I've learned is that it's not common for AI researchers to discuss the risks of their work. Sometimes that's because people want to do that, but they don't feel equipped. As we discussed earlier, it's pretty difficult for scientists to think outside of their very narrow technical field. But other times, it's because they just don't see it as within their remit. They consider themselves there to push the boundaries of science, and the impact of their work is not their concern. So this is something I've encountered when talking to people, is that even researchers might want to discuss the impacts of their work, but they said that when they go and do that if they bring a risk up with their research lab, they get like funny looks, and it's just not really the done thing. Obviously, this is different cultures and labs, and some are more amenable to this. But one thing I am really keen to do is it a normalized mainstream thing to do for AI researchers to discuss the potential risks of their work. Another thing I've realized is the extent to which coordination challenges play a role in this. So as an example, a couple of examples, firstly, often conferences have policies like open access policies, open data policies that preclude partial release options. So if you have a model or a paper that you've written and you want to redact some of the information, or you potentially don't want to release the training data for privacy concerns or other ethical reasons, then it can be very difficult to get that published because of conferences having certain policies. And obviously in this case, both both groups are trying to act responsibly. Conferences have implemented these policies for good reason, but also the research labs are also trying to do what they think is in the best. So we have two groups that are trying to do the best thing, but they are sort of at odds with each other, and we need a way to resolve that. Another coordination challenge is the fact that if any of you have worked in academia, you are probably very familiar with the publish or perish mentality. And a lot of researchers, even if they are worried about the risks or impacts of their work, are going to be incentivized to publish it because they get rewarded for the more papers they have. And they also want to be the first to discover something. And if they don't publish their paper out of an abundance of caution, then it's quite possible that someone else is just going to publish it, and then they lose out on getting the credit for that. So the problem of accreditation, how we navigate that, is also an interesting coordination challenge we're going to face as a community. Okay, so now moving on to what we can learn from other fields. So firstly, I want to look at the life sciences, because I think this probably has the most interesting parallels. So firstly, just on a fairly mundane level, it would be really weird for the pharmaceutical industry to publish the results of clinical trials for new drugs without talking about the side effects of the drug. And so that's, I think, a good analogy for what we're trying to do here, is just, being upfront about the possible side effects or risks of the technology. The life sciences community also has what's called the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, which was established in the wake of the anthrax attacks in the 90s as a way to provide some oversight for biosecurity issues. And I think this is something that we could potentially learn from in the AI community. We don't have anything like this at this point, but it could potentially be something we might want to set up, at least in an advisory capacity, if not more of an oversight capacity. There's also more of a culture of responsibility in the life sciences community. Now, this isn't necessarily completely widespread, but it's something that is more common for researchers to just have that sense of individual responsibility, which again is something that we may want to promote more within AI. Moving on to cybersecurity. In cybersecurity, there is a concept called coordinated vulnerability disclosure. And what this means is when a security researcher or just a member of the public finds a bug in a system, rather than publishing that bug to the world, they can go through a coordinated disclosure route where they actually get in touch with the vendor who created that software. So imagine you find a bug in your browser that you realize could be exploited in some dangerous way. Rather than just posting that online, you might go directly to Google if you use Chrome or Microsoft or whoever, and let them know that that bug exists. And usually what happens is they give them a time limit of around 90 days to fix the bug before they are going to publish it. And the reason for that is it really then sort of incentivizes the company to get it fixed within a short amount of time before that bug is going to be made public and be potentially quite damaging to them. So I think this is, again, an interesting thing we could think about for AI. As we see AI having impacts on the world, could there be a way we could adopt something like coordinated vulnerability disclosure? As an example, I mentioned deepfakes earlier. Imagine if the research team behind deepfakes, instead of releasing their work immediately, they maybe could have worked with other teams who are working on deepfake detection mechanisms. So then you would use both the nature of the deepfakes and also the mechanism to detect deepfakes in parallel. It could possibly help. There's also an issue of the offense-defense balance of publishing information. So it's sometimes unclear when a piece of information is going to be more likely to be used for good or for harm. So if there's a phrase like sunlight is the best disinfectant, and sometimes people use this in the context of cybersecurity, and it's better to just publish the bug openly because that gives, especially for open source code, that means that lots of people can work on fixing that bug. So in some cases, it might be better to actually publish it as widely as possible because it's more likely to benefit the people working for social good. But in other circumstances, it might be more likely to benefit people trying to cause harm. So you need to think about, whenever you're publishing information like this, who is it more likely to benefit? Those working for social benefit, or those working for malicious or harmful use cases. And then finally, in cybersecurity, there is they've kind of gone some way to solving this accreditation problem I mentioned earlier. When a security researcher finds a bug in a system, of course, they can't necessarily get the credit for that immediately if they're going to go through a coordinated vulnerability disclosure route. And within cybersecurity, the kudos of discovering bugs is very, very important and motivating. So they have a system where they will get I think it's a certificate or something to show that they were the first person to spot this vulnerability, even if they couldn't necessarily shout it from the rooftops straight away. And then finally, I wanted to mention nuclear. So nuclear is a great example of a technology that is both dual use and high stakes. It has many beneficial applications in energy, but also can go very wrong if there are nuclear meltdowns, or can be used for military purposes. And I think an interesting example here is Chernobyl. So there are some people that argue that the disaster could have been a lot less bad if there was more of a culture of transparency and openness among the workers at these nuclear plants. So this is an example of where being overly secretive or overly restrictive can actually end up being very damaging, and we want to be cognizant of that. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about 5 possible interventions that we're considering, as well as their limitations. So the first one is what we have already mentioned, broader impact statements. The idea being to encourage conferences, journals, and grant makers to require researchers to write about the negative impacts of their work when they submit papers or funding requests, that kind of thing. The problem with this is that there are that it creates extra hoops for researchers to jump through to get published, and it's already a pretty difficult process to get published. And we don't want to just add random extra costs on top of these. We don't want to add costs to the process for no good reason. There's also the issue that it could create perverse incentives. So if you are worried that your paper is going to get rejected because it has negative impacts or risks, then you're probably not going to want to draw attention to those negative consequences. So what I'm worried about is that we might see a lot of people writing their broader impact statements and mentioning a few of the sort of slight ways that this technology could be harmful, but not really thinking, not really engaging substantially with the genuine risks or potentially more of the dangerous sides of it. And that kind of lulls us into a false sense of security, where we think we've done a good job at we're thinking about how this technology could be misused, but you're actually missing some of the more genuine issues with it because people are worried about that paper getting rejected. So I think we need to be very careful about how we design a requirement like broader impact statements to avoid that. And then a final limitation on this is that it might give bad guys ideas. If you are a terrorist or someone trying to use technology in a malicious way, what could be better than being able to look up the latest advancements in the technology and then have a whole section that just describes all the interesting ways you could use it for harm. We want to be careful to avoid that too. Another intervention we are considering is more internal review processes. So many academic institutions currently have ethics committees or institutional review boards which assess research for human welfare issues. And maybe we could get research labs to institute pre-publication review processes that also check for broader impacts risks as well. A few limitations of this approach include its bureaucratic red tape. If you are someone who has had to put their research through an institutional review board or an ethics committee, it can be a very painful, long process, and it's not pleasant. So we don't want to add this unnecessarily. We also want to be transparent and consistent about how these review processes are applied. Another controversy, which I haven't spoken about today, but was a very recent thing that happened in the AI community, was a prominent AI ethics researcher, Timnit Gebru, getting essentially fired from Google for complicated reasons around a paper that she'd written and their internal review process. And there are some arguments that suggest that this might not have happened in such a unfortunate way if they had more consistently enforced standards and were much more transparent about their review process. So we need to be careful about that being unfairly enforced, essentially. Thing that we've touched on already is the idea of partial or restricted publication in some way. So examples might include the staged release approach that OpenAI took with their language model, an ask for access approach where if you have a piece of research, if someone gets in contact with you and asks to have access to the model, then maybe you can do some vetting of that person and give them access if they seem legit. Or you could potentially put your models behind a rate-limited API, which will hopefully prevent people who are trying to misuse the system and make sure it can only be used for legitimate research purposes. Another example here would be something like the coordinated disclosure mechanisms that we discussed from cybersecurity. Or we could think about potentially categorizing research by risk levels. So there might be some types of research where it's pretty obvious that there's not that big a risk, and so they can just fly on through. Whereas other types of research that might be a bit more problematic, we could take a closer look at and maybe redact some information or whatever else is needed. There are limitations with this approach too. Firstly, this is probably the one that most risks eroding the norms of openness and reproducibility. It could also potentially contribute to power dynamics and imbalances. So if only a certain set of people have access to the latest research, then obviously that goes against the idea of democratizing technology. So we need to be careful about that. It could also potentially be abused by companies who want to use it as a way to protect their intellectual property. They could claim that they're not releasing their latest research because they're trying to do the responsible thing, but secretly they're actually just trying to keep their trade secrets to themselves. We also have the accreditation problem with this approach, and it's hard to judge what's risky in advance, especially foundational research. So going back to our very first example of the bandit algorithms, do you think it would really have been feasible point to predict that we could see negative consequences from something that felt very foundational and theoretical at the time, a logistical difficulty. Another thing we're considering is expert advisors. So the idea would be a multidisciplinary pool of experts available for consultation on difficult publication decisions. And you could imagine this being available to researchers as well as publishers. So if you're a researcher who has been tasked with writing a broader impact statement and you don't know where to start, potentially you could consult this panel of experts who can help, and maybe they come from ethics and philosophy and politics and economics and all sorts of different fields. Even we've thought about including sci-fi authors because who is better at judging predicting, or who is better at thinking of ways that technology can be used for dystopian purposes than sci-fi authors? And so potentially having access to those people would allow researchers and publishers to get a better sense of the possible negative consequences of their work. The idea behind this would be, initially it could be advisory only, so you could just choose to consult this panel to help you write better statements or help you assess the impact of technology. But potentially at some point we could empower it more formally along the line of the NSABB I mentioned in the life sciences. Some limitations to this idea include that it's very logistically difficult just to get all those different types of experts to collaborate on this and be available and do this additional work. There are potentially legal issues around trade secrets, and we might need to set up NDAs, just a whole host of legal issues there. And also this sort of general question of who gets to decide, why does this panel of advisors get to make these calls, and what does it mean for accountability if they if they don't anticipate a particular risk of some research and then that research ends up very negative, that can be tricky. And then finally, another thing we're trying to do is generate informational resources to help researchers and anyone in the research system challenge. So some examples of that include a taxonomy of risks for AI, a checklist of prompts for anticipating impact. So this could be questions that we would ask researchers to ask themselves before they go publish, or it might be questions they should ask themselves to help them write broader impact statements. We might want to produce best practices for internal review processes to avoid some of the pitfalls that I've touched on, and also historical case studies looking at other fields or other times, other uses of AI that we've observed to learn from past examples. The limitations of this method is just primarily that it's a lot of effort generating these things. At this point, we're not 100% sure how useful they'll be, so it's a bit experimental. And also, we are lacking evidence to make them rigorous. If I wanted to come up with a set of questions for researchers to ask themselves, and in fact, we do have an initial version of that on the Partnership on AI website, it's mostly just from us talking to people, thinking about it, and coming up with what we reckon is a good set of questions, but we don't have really rigorous evidence at this point that they are genuinely useful at getting researchers to think about the risks of their work. Okay, so just to wrap up with a few parting thoughts, we have covered a lot. We talked about the impacts of AI research, we talked about some controversies in the community and how that led to some difficult questions. I talked about what I've learned from working on this issue for a while, what we can learn from other fields, and then I discussed some interventions that we're exploring as well as their limitations. So I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Firstly, time is of the essence. Scientific progress is incremental, and so we really do need to think about this now to set us on a positive trajectory as the technology becomes increasingly advanced. And the benefits of good publication notes increase in step with advancing capabilities. So it might not be a huge problem if we don't have this figured out right now, because the technology is still not as advanced as it could be. But as we go further down that line, it's going to become increasingly important to have this figured out. Even if you're wary of the interventions that I have discussed today, I hope that we can probably all agree that getting better calibrated at predicting the impacts of AI is a good thing. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, it's just that we should be thinking a little bit more about the impacts of our work and the effect it's having on society. But despite all of the challenges that I've covered, I do in fact remain optimistic and excited about the future of AI. That's the nature of high stakes research. It does have some serious risks, but also the benefits are really, really huge. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rosie. That was absolutely fantastic. We'll be taking a 15-minute break now, so we'll be back at, we'll call it 5 past. Yeah, 5 past seems about right, which we'll be back with a Q&A, followed by the lock-ins Razor Zoom pub. While we have our break, you might want to consider signing up for our new Discord server, which will allow you to chat with text, voice, and video whenever you want to and be part of the Skeptics in the Pub online community in between talks. And a link for that is in the chat or can be found at sitp.online/contact. Just a reminder that Slido is still available at sitp.online/ask, where you can ask or vote for your favourite questions. And we will be back shortly. See you in a bit. Hello and welcome back. Hope you've had a nice break, and we will, without further ado, start with the Q&A. We've had some fantastic questions, so thank you to everybody for that. We will start off with a question from Dr. Squirrel. Do you think every paper should be ethically reviewed, not from inception, but from a conference point of view, and why?
So there's a lot to unpack in that question. So I think probably it's going to be overkill to review every single paper for ethics. And I also think a lot of the issues I mentioned about like perverse incentives arise. So I don't know if I would say that every single paper should be ethically reviewed at this point. I think what I want to do first is just really encourage people to start reflecting themselves. And then later down the line, it might make sense to have it become a more common part of conferences or journals to have an ethical review process as well. But I think that's probably a bit premature at this point.
So further down the process of once we've got these things set into place, that eventually we go to that.
Once we've like as a society and a community kind of dwelled on these questions for a bit longer and really thought through the potential impacts of doing something like that. Like doing this kind of work is interesting because I have to think about even whether the things I'm saying should, like, what the consequence, like, I want to be responsibly publishing the things that I'm saying as well. So it's kind of like I'm trying to apply the principles to my own work. And I think there's definitely a risk that, like, we can do something that sounds like, in principle, a good idea, but actually ends up having all these unintended consequences. So I'm always a bit hesitant about implementing things prematurely, rather than like making sure we as a society have had a chance to really think it through. But I think there are some things that are just like clearly, even saying clearly, I'm not even totally sure of myself, but I think it's like pretty hard to imagine how getting better at thinking about the risks of work is going to have negative effects. Whereas something like a policy change within conferences to implement ethics reviews, I think that could be a much more dangerous process, in the sense that it could have consequences that we didn't anticipate.
And I think from a skeptical point of view, this is one of the things that comes to mind, is sharing things on Facebook as satire and the unintended consequences that you share it with some friends, but then that's seen by their friends, and the unintended consequences of the people who don't understand the satire behind what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's tough because in that situation, like, is the right thing to do that no one is allowed to make jokes? Like, that seems like a bad world to be in. So we don't want that. We have to like do a cost benefit analysis and just see if there's ways that we can still retain the things we enjoy and the good things without while mitigating at least some of the potential risks of it.
Okay, Dr. Squirrel actually got the second most voted question as well. So, in your opinion, do you believe all research projects should be entirely transparent, regardless of potential revenue? Asking as a PhD researcher. So,
are we talking about like the potential revenue of that idea? Okay, I think this is asking like, if you're doing some research and you come across something that could be like very lucrative, should you be obliged to publish that? I don't necessarily think so. I think it's more important to be transparent when there are like potential conflicts of interest in terms of how the research has been funded. I think there's possibly a difference between like academic research and industry research. Like, obviously lots of companies do research internally, not just within AI, but on, product development research that is not going to be published because that's how they want to make their money. So getting rid of that would have, again, probably quite widespread consequences on the way our economic system works if no one is allowed to have any trade secrets anymore. But I do think there is something to be said for especially academic type research. And it gets messy and complicated because I think AI is a bit unusual in that a lot of the industry labs also take part in the academic process. So you have, DeepMind, Google, Microsoft, all of these companies actually playing a huge role in the academic community within machine learning and publishing research at conferences. So it does get a bit murky to think about like the extent to which the research they're doing should count as like industrial trade secrets or as like academic style research. So I think in general, like, transparency is obviously great, but again, that would constitute a pretty huge change to how things are done at the moment. And I would imagine there would be some side effects we would want to be careful of with that.
And I think there was another interesting point brought up in the chat earlier today about there is also a third stream, which is sort of military secrets, which are, again, completely separate. Somebody was talking about the stealth bombers where they were developed in, I think they said the 60s, and there was nothing known about them until the 80s.
Yeah, and so I mentioned nuclear as like a possible field we want to learn from, and another one that we are, or like a kind of related aspect to that, is the Manhattan Project. Like, that was done pretty much completely in secret because obviously, there's like military issues for it, and you need to be very careful. And I think like there are some people who argue that the way towards general AI or superintelligence should be considered kind of a military, within the remit of the military, because whoever ends up developing that technology first is likely to have a huge strategic advantage in the world. So, like, should we have a Manhattan Project for AGI? That's another question. I didn't have time to get into that in the talk today, but it's something we're looking at as like as part of our research into other fields.
Okay, moving on to the next one. So Andy Wilson asks, "Hi Rosie, based on AI, this is quite a big question, so this should be interesting. Based on AI that has happened, what is the coolest example of AI? What's the worst example of AI? And what's the most murderous example of AI?"
Okay. So the coolest example, I don't know if this is going to be the coolest example overall, but one thing that is like very much on my mind because it happened very recently is a system that was released by OpenAI, and I think it's called DALL-E, DALL-E. And basically, you give it a sentence like an armchair in the shape of an avocado, and it like generates a whole load of images based on that sentence. And they're not like pulled from the internet; they are like genuinely generated from scratch. And it like constructs all these ways that an armchair could look like an avocado, and you can like give it lots of different things. And it is pretty mind-blowing. I think that was one of the first times when it really hit me that like, wow, that is going to put a lot of graphic designers out of business, or comic book artists, or like, suddenly everyone can just generate these amazing images based on words. And I suddenly started to be like, yeah, okay, this is the start of the more like white collar type knowledge work getting automated. So it was very, very cool, but kind of terrifying. And then the worst example of AI, oh man, there's been some real interesting attempts at using machine learning for different things. I think probably a pretty bad one was the system that tried to predict sexuality from people's photos. Like, come on, guys, that's clearly just not a good idea. Let's just not go there. And then what was the last one? The most murderous.
The most murderous, yeah.
Oh, man, what is the most murderous example?
Well, have any AIs killed anybody yet?
Well, I mean, self-driving cars have killed people, so I don't know if you could consider that.
But was it the AI that killed them, or was it the driver in the AI car taking control?
No, it was. So it was they. As far as I'm aware, all of them have a driver in them who is supposed to intervene in emergencies, and there was like some instance where the driver wasn't paying attention or whatever, and so they didn't actually intervene when they should have done, and then it resulted in someone being hit. So yeah, probably AVs are the most murderous example I can think of right now, though. There may be
possibly manufacturing industrial robots that potentially could have killed somebody in. Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as murderous, but
yeah. It's interesting because a lot of the most obvious examples of this are going to be like the interface between AI and cyber physical systems. So like when AI starts to interact with like physical robots and things like that. But I could also imagine, maybe not right now, but in the future, as AI is more and more in control of like our financial system or our energy infrastructure, like the more that we move towards AI to manage those kind of like huge infrastructure type things, the more I could imagine like widespread, quite murderous things happening. If they cut off electricity to everyone for something malfunctions and that happens, or the financial markets just entirely crash. You could imagine things going pretty badly.
Andrew asks, how likely is it that the commercial world is way ahead on AI research? What does it mean for the governance of AI ethics and research? Is there a role for regulation?
So interestingly, the partnership in AI where I work now was, I think, partially set up as a response to this problem, where it is true that the commercial world is just moving super, super fast on these issues, and government and regulatory efforts can't necessarily keep up. For one thing, policymakers don't necessarily have the technical expertise to really understand what's going on with these systems, but also just putting in new laws and regulations takes a long, long time. So partnership on AI was sort of like, okay, well, given that that's going to take a long time, maybe we can sort of like set something up outside of that to try and not necessarily regulate, but like move things in a more responsible way. So I think, this is definitely a problem. I think there is a role for regulation. But again, I do think it's necessary to be cautious about that, because it is also very easy to implement regulations that end up backfiring and having doing the opposite of what they intended. So we just need to be cautious.
Anonymous asks, what's the practical difference between an ethics review and a normal biased peer reviewer?
I don't know if I'm fully understanding this, but like, I think I'm not sure if the question is getting at like, won't like ethics reviewers also be biased, just like peer reviewers are biased, and therefore is there what is the point in that? Yes, I mean everyone has biases, but I think that doesn't necessarily mean the answer is to just like throw peer review out the window in any way. Like the system is imperfect, but hopefully, it's better than nothing. And an ethics review, just perhaps this is, I'm not sure if I'm fully getting what the question was getting at, but like another way to interpret the question is like, what is the difference between the standard peer review process that we have now versus like an ethical review process? And currently the peer review process focuses on things like, what is the contribution that the paper is making, and is the methodology sound, and those sorts of issues. And it doesn't currently incorporate any questions around, or any a focus on the broader impacts of the work. So you could potentially just extend the existing peer review process to ask reviewers to consider those things as well. Or you could have a whole separate process that is just focused on ethics and broader impacts. I'm not sure which is the best.
But as you said earlier, that potentially the peer reviewers will have absolutely no experience of analysing ethics or whether or not something morality. Their experience might be as a particle physicist or something like that, where they have no experience of dealing with that. So actually, maybe a separate person, a bit like statisticians are used in papers to analyse, where the main scientist is not necessarily as up to scratch on stats.
Yes. I think there's definitely a role for bringing in other areas of expertise. But I do think even I think if we like, people doing AI research are not stupid. And I think if they exercise the muscle of like thinking a little bit more about the way their technology could be used, I think like there's kind of like a learned helplessness thing here where people sort of assume it's going to be a really difficult thing for them to do. But I think that we can probably do a better job than we're doing at the moment. But I also agree that, bringing in external expertise as well is a good thing.
Matt in Hat asks, do you have one or more favourite science fiction views of the future of AI?
Oh, so I mean, it depends if you want to go dystopian or utopian in this. I think one of my favorite dystopian portrayal of the genuine issues with AI is Ex Machina, and I don't want to give much away in case people haven't seen it, but I think like that does a pretty good job of illustrating some of the things that AI researchers are worried about as we get increasingly advanced AI. And then like maybe a more utopian one. I don't know, maybe this isn't quite AI actually. I was going to say probably my like favorite utopian vision of the future is the Black Mirror episode San Junipero, which maybe is controversial because Black Mirror is usually not seen as utopian. I think that's a great episode, though it's not really super, I guess could be arguably related to AI.
Okay. Anonymous asks, why does mechanization from AI threaten mass unemployment when mechanization from the Industrial Revolution did the opposite?
So my understanding is that the mechanization from the Industrial Revolution in the short term did cause a lot of unemployment and caused a lot of civil unrest. So there is just like an immediate, like short term issue there that I think is the case. Yes, of course, like overall, it seems to have generated more jobs. I'm very uncertain on this question. Like, it could be the case that history will repeat itself and we'll go through a short-term period of turmoil, but overall we'll end up somehow with more jobs. I just think there is something a little bit qualitatively different about this. Like, the Industrial Revolution was replicating the human strength, essentially. But our unique advantage as a species is not our strength, it's our intellect. And that's what allowed us to have a whole load of new jobs created, even when we'd automated our muscles. Whether that would still be the case when we have something that can match us on intellect, I don't know. Like, what else is there? Maybe my imagination is just not good enough to imagine that. But it does feel like as we increasingly are able to automate away all the things that humans tend to be especially good at, what is left? And I don't necessarily see this as the problem because I am in favor of a post-scarcity world where we all live a life of leisure and philosophy and art and friendship and travel, and it's great, and we just like have our automated robots providing everything we need. I think that's awesome. So I'm like, I don't think the goal should be retaining jobs just for the sake of having jobs, personally. I know a lot of people get meaning from jobs, and we need to figure that out, but like I don't think we should like halt progress just because it might put people out of work, but I do think that it is something we're going to have to face as a species, given the way that we are currently set up as a society. And I do expect some disruption, at least in the short term, potentially even in the long term.
Something I think about myself, I work in retail, and I'm constantly thinking, how long is it going to be before I'm replaced? How long is it going to be before a machine does my job? Because so many elements of, and I'm just using retail as an example, but so many elements of retail have been replaced with machines, down to, the self-service checkouts and just little things like that. But how long is it going to be before AI robot can sell mobile phones, or an AI robot can be the manager of a department, or all of those things?
What will you do? You have like a plan for what you would do in that situation?
No. No, not right now. I think personally, the role I do is still a way off being automated, and quite a long way off being automated. But there are other elements within the workplace. Stacking shelves. Realistically, I can see that being automated within the fairly near future, and I believe it's already to a certain extent being done in a lot of warehouses, where a lot of it is done by robots. But it's just something that we all have to think about. It's something that I think about in my workplace, especially when I hear talks about like this. And also, you read things in the paper, they've managed to create a AI that can do this. And you just start thinking, how much longer's my job got?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And like, hopefully we will be able to like reskill people, and people can like find new work to go into. But it just feels like we're like chasing like a rolling ball coming at us. Like, yes, we might be able to like dodge it a bit, but it's still coming at us, and like eventually we're going to run out of places to run to. So we need to think a bit more creatively about the structure of society and work.
It might well be that we go to a shorter work week, and we then have each person works less, but the same number of jobs are out there.
But then that was something that was posed, I think, like in the 50s or something, because everyone was like, oh, we're all being so productive and earning all this money, and like we can all reduce our productivity by going down to 4 days a week or whatever. And then that just never happened, and people are busier than ever. So I don't know. It would be great to get to that point, but somehow we seem to keep finding ways to keep people occupied, at least for now.
Okay, we've got a question from S. Hunts, I think it is, but it might be Shunts. How actually intelligent is the AI at the moment? What level of or animal or insect thinking are we up to currently?
Oh, good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I know there are people who are like trying to research this and like, are we at the level of a fruit fly or something? But it's a bit hard because you can't make a direct comparison. So this, and I didn't get into this in the talk either, but like even the term human general intelligence or human level general intelligence is flawed, because if you imagine like the full problem space of intelligence, human is like one confined blob within the whole space that you could imagine intelligence being. So like trying to replicate that exact blob might not be the way we go with AI. It might do like a different space of intelligence. So it's kind of hard to like say like, oh, current state of AI maps to like this insect or this animal, because it's like a qualitatively different thing. So I think it's a valid question. People are trying to track that, but I don't think we should be thinking of this as like a linear track that we are moving along. It's more like at least a 2D, probably more space where like we're kind of darting all over the place.
So we've also got the fact that, computers are already smarter than us at some things. Mental arithmetic, for example, exactly. They absolutely smash us. There's no way I can calculate anywhere near like a computer. Likewise with, chess playing. And you've got these specific tasks that they're really good at. We just don't have that, what we consider humanoid intelligence. But it's funny
because that's like, I've heard like people say that computer, like the things that a very advanced human can do, like play chess really well or do amazing mathematics, computers do super easily. But the things that a toddler can do as a human, computers can't do at all. They can't like
pattern recognition and
all of that stuff. So that's exactly the point. Is it's not just a linear thing that we expect people to progress on a certain scale. It's like they're going all over the place with respect to our type of intelligence, and we're just one type within a whole problem space of different sorts of intelligence.
There's also the question out there: do we need an artificial human intelligence, or do we need artificial intelligence that can do certain things?
Do you mean do we need it as in hey, maybe we should stop working on it, or
No, not at all. No, as in to do the things that we want AIs to do right now, and I'm talking about right now. Yeah. It doesn't need the ability to be like a human.
Yeah. So this is also super interesting because there are some people who are primarily motivated by the scientific challenge of human intelligence. Like they want to replicate brains or that's their scientific goal. But you're right, in practice, in reality, we probably don't need that to do a lot of things that we actually want AI to help us with. And there are some approaches Eric Drexler has an approach called comprehensive AI services, where the model is rather than creating a human general intelligence, you have AI services, many of them doing one thing really, really well, and they sort of interact with each other in such a way that you can do what you want to do, but they never get to the point of a general intelligence that we would need to worry about. I think there are definitely people who advocate moving more in that direction. The challenge is, how do you handle the people who really, really want to? And I'm kind of curious about can we actually get to human intelligence? I wouldn't want to stop that from happening, even though it's possibly very dangerous. So I don't know how we reconcile those things.
Neither do I, and I will leave that to other people to think about. Igor asks, how are you not in a constant state of terror knowing what could come from AI research, from instrumental convergence to general kill all humans attitude?
Igor, you presume a lot. I am in a constant state of terror, genuinely. When I'm not worried about COVID or climate change or whatever, AI. I don't want to get too dark here, but the deeper you get into this, the more terrifying it really is. And I am pretty worried about our ability to overcome this problem. I think from a practical, functioning as a human, you kind of have to put it out of your mind and just we just have to do our best and see if we can navigate it. But I think there are serious challenges ahead of us as a species. And I keep thinking to myself, imagine I am in a sci-fi novel. What an exciting time to be alive. This is the crux of when all the action's about to happen, and try and appreciate the adventure, even if it is terrifying.
Yeah. Neil asks, as an organisation providing AI ML based research tools, is there a place for building ethical review into the data science pipeline or data governance?
Yeah. So we've talked mostly today about the research publication pipeline, but I think there's also a very interesting conversation to be had around the deployment of tools and products, which is probably what I'm going to be shifting my focus a little bit towards this year. I think this question talks about it in terms of ethical review, but I think we can talk about responsible deployment practices. Again, this is something where we can learn from other fields. So if you think about the aerospace industry and generally other engineering fields, there's a lot more of a culture of safety around how things are built. There are checklists, there are audits, there are oversight processes to really ensure that the things that are getting built do what they're supposed to do and do it safely. And so, I'm interested in thinking about what we can steal from those other industries from an engineering safety perspective and apply to AI product development.
Anonymous asks, isn't it quite likely that people most advanced in their AI field are those who aren't going to adhere by any policies anyway?
I don't know if I would agree with that. I think, it's possible that there are going to be people who don't take these concerns seriously, but I don't know. I'd like to talk about this more. Maybe we can hang out in the Zoom pub afterwards and talk about this because it doesn't seem obvious to me that just because someone is advanced in the field, that would make them less likely to adhere to these policies anyway?
I think you tend to get bad actors in every kind of industry. I'm thinking specifically right now of genetics with the Chinese scientist who did genetic engineering on human fetuses and got in a lot of trouble for it because it wasn't allowed.
Yeah, because there was a moratorium on that, but then some people ignore it.
And I can see the same in AI, where some people will ignore whatever's going on. But most people don't.
And I think, I pointed out in the talk the challenge of coordination, and I think that's another great example of it is like, how do you get everybody on board with this, given that, there are always going to be bad actors. And I think hopefully it is still worth the effort if most people are going to adhere to it, even if there are a few bad actors, and maybe we can have other mechanisms to deal with the bad actors. So it still seems worthwhile to me.
Absolutely. Grimbeard asks, would it be useful for AI researchers to see what people in forensics do in terms of publication? After all, their research can be used by criminal offenders.
I hadn't thought of forensics as an analogy, but I am very interested in that, and I will follow up on it. Thanks for the suggestion.
That's really interesting insight. We've got Dr. Squirrel again. No, we haven't. Sorry, we've got Igor. What can we do with researchers, developers who don't want to be accountable for their work and prefer to go underground? So that kind of leads in from that previous question.
What can we do? So, there are some mechanisms that people are exploring about how to track progress. So right now, one of the best ways to create a very powerful AI algorithm is to train something on a lot of data with a lot of computation. And if we can somehow track, Amazon Web Services, for example, is a service that a lot of people use to train their models. If we can figure out where people, what services people are using to train their models, and we can track what kind of levels of computation they're using, whether the levels of training data they're using, all of that kind of thing, that can help us figure out who is closer to getting something like AGI, or who is developing secret, very advanced models. So I guess maybe there's another analogy here with nuclear weapons detection. There are ways that people are trying to develop to detect nuclear weapons, and an area of research that's ongoing in AI is how can we do sort of a similar thing with AI research? So even if someone is trying to subvert the policies, you can still sort of track that they're up to no good, even if you're not quite sure exactly what.
Yeah, I mean, because there are, I'm sure, lots of AI projects going on that nobody knows anything about, being government or anybody knows anything about, because it's military secrets or it's future commercial products that they don't want to make public. Tilly asks, how do commercial patents and businesses protecting their proprietary technology and technology impact AI ethics and the wider research community? Do they interact enough?
Commercial patents and businesses protecting it. I think this goes back to kind of what I was saying before around the need for businesses to be able to conduct research, but also if they're interacting with the academic research community, there's also a need for transparency. I think with businesses and commercial organizations, there are a number of levers that can be pulled to help influence their activities. So one is external regulation and oversight from the government. One is consumer pressure. So if consumers are not happy with the ethics approach that an organization is taking, that can help. Employee activism is another one. So as I mentioned, AI engineers and researchers tend to have a lot of market power, and we've seen already stuff like Project Maven at Google. So Project Maven was a thing around it was basically Google getting involved in military applications, and a lot of Google employees were not happy about that. They kind of had an ethical objection, and so they protested it, and Google ended up walking back that contract that they had. So there are ways that you can hold commercial organizations to account for ethical standards in different ways.
Anonymous asks, might lack of publication mean that the good guys don't know what they should be looking out for, rather than preventing the bad guys from finding out?
Yep. Definitely. That is absolutely an issue. And this is why I'm like, of all of the things I suggested in the talk, I think the restricting publication one is the most like dangerous, or like the one that I would advocate the most caution around. Some of the other things I think are just like generally good practices, but this one would probably have the most widespread unintended consequences that we would need to worry about. So that's the one I'd be most cautious about recommending at this point. Like, I think it's good to experiment. Like the OpenAI staged release approach, a lot of people have a lot of criticisms about how they handled it, but I do think that it was at least a good conversation starter for dealing with these issues and for like experimenting with different publication methods. So I think it's good for us to experiment with things like that. But yeah, for implementing any concrete policies around restricting publication, I think could be, again, it's premature at this point.
Yeah, definitely. And it will obviously lead to less interaction between universities and academic groups. Sarah says, brilliant talk. Can you elaborate on the bandit theory again?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about what I know of it, and I'm definitely not an expert in this particular theory. But so it's essentially you're trying to optimize based on limited resources. And the multi-arm bandit algorithm in particular is a mix of explore and exploit. So you initially try a load of different options. You're exploring your environment, you're trying different things out, and you're figuring out what results you get. Once you have identified which machine gives you the highest payout, or like which strategy you're taking is doing the best for you, you then double down on that one and you exploit it and get the maximum reward. It's a form of reinforcement learning algorithm. There are many different reinforcement learning approaches, and this is the whole field of research that I am definitely not an expert in. But yeah, I'm happy to talk more about it in the Zoom pub, or point you towards things you can read up on more about it.
I think we're going for the last question now. So we have a question from QuestionBot 5669. How can I tell if I'm an AI or a real person? I had to resit the Turing test 3 times.
You can't, I guess is my answer. I don't know, like maybe we're all living in a simulation, so maybe we're all AI. It's a tough one. It's like, how do you know if you're in a dream or not? You kind of feel like you know, but how you can't really justify it in any coherent way. And I sort of feel the same about this question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rosie. It was absolutely fantastic. Please put your virtual hands together in the chat and say a big thank you to Rosie. We will be back next week with, I'm going to butcher his name, but I'm going to try anyway, Mirko Gutjahr, who will be talking about pseudo-archaeology, fake news, and new fakes. But for those of you that haven't had enough Skeptics online for the day, we'll be launching the Lock-ins Razor Zoom call in a few minutes at sitp.online/virtualpub. And you can also join our Discord server, which the link will be in the chat. And it's also available at sitp.online/contact. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you very much to Rosie, and we'll see you next week.